The moment you stopped chasing, you didn't just create distance. You triggered a truth that could no longer stay hidden. And now, everything that was once uncertain is slowly beginning to reveal what it really was all along. Take a moment and just breathe into this. You're here for a reason, and it doesn't feel random because it isn't. Something in your path has been quietly aligning, bringing you to this message at exactly the point you were meant to receive it. There is a shift happening around you right now. On the surface, nothing may look different, but beneath what you can see, something significant is moving. Even if you can't fully understand it yet, there is a deeper process unfolding that is more powerful than what your immediate perspective can grasp. This begins the moment you stop chasing. You didn't argue. You didn't send another message trying to fix how you were being perceived or explain your place in their life. You simply stepped back. You stopped reaching towards someone who had grown used to receiving your energy without offering the same in return. And in that quiet decision, something meaningful changed. The person who once relied on your presence is now sitting inside a silence they are not familiar with. The steady attention, the emotional consistency, the effort you kept giving without hesitation, all of it has been pulled back. And what remains is not conflict, not drama, but absence. And absence has a way of speaking louder than anything said out loud. Right now, even if it doesn't show on the surface, they are thinking. They are questioning. They are noticing feelings they never had to face before, because your effort used to fill every gap before it could even be recognized. When you stop chasing someone, the shift is not loud, but it is real. Before, the connection was carried mostly by your emotional investment, your messages, your availability, your consistency. That created a rhythm where they could remain comfortable without needing to confront what they truly wanted or what they were willing to give. In that space, nothing was fully tested. Nothing was fully chosen. Your presence made things easy to avoid deciding. But real connection is meant to involve two active hearts, not one carrying the weight alone. When only one person is reaching, building, and sustaining everything, it stops being mutual and becomes convenience. The moment you withdrew, that imbalance could no longer stay hidden. What once felt stable to them now feels different, less certain, less predictable. And human nature is not comfortable with that kind of emptiness when something meaningful feels at risk. Proverbs reminds us to guard the heart above everything else, because everything flows from it. In your own way, stepping back became an act of protection. You stopped abandoning yourself just to keep something else going, and in that space, clarity begins to surface. Before your silence, their response to you was mostly passive. They received your energy without needing to question it or match it. It felt steady, predictable, always there. But now that it's gone, attention becomes active. The absence forces awareness. The mind starts revisiting conversations. It starts filling in gaps. It starts asking what changed, what shifted, what is no longer being given. This is how awareness returns when comfort is disrupted. It is not confusion for no reason. It is the result of an imbalance finally becoming visible. You were holding more than your share without even realizing how much it was shaping the dynamic. Now that space is empty, and that emptiness is impossible to ignore. As Scripture teaches in 1 Corinthians, God is not the source of disorder, but of peace. And often, what feels like confusion is actually the exposure of something that was never aligned in the first place. The stillness reveals what constant effort was hiding. What used to feel like certainty is now being questioned. What used to feel effortless for them now requires reflection. And what used to be sustained by your presence now has to stand on its own. Even in moments like this, there is a deeper order at work. Psalm 37:23 speaks about how a person's steps are guided beyond their awareness. Sometimes that guidance shows up in the form of stepping away from what was quietly draining you, even if it took time to recognize it. Your decision to stop chasing didn't just create distance, it revealed truth. And truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in absence, in the space where effort used to be. What's left now is clarity beginning to surface where confusion once lived. They are now being confronted with something they previously didn't have to fully acknowledge: how one-sided things may have become, how much you were the one initiating, and how much emotional effort you were carrying without equal return. And in that realization, a kind of uncomfortable honesty begins to surface. The kind that's actually needed for real emotional clarity and healing. In the quiet that follows your withdrawal, there is a stillness that doesn't just create distance, it creates reflection. Without the usual flow of your attention, they are left alone with their own thoughts. And in that space, feelings that were previously brushed aside or ignored start to rise more clearly. They are forced, in a way, to sit with what they actually feel and what they've been avoiding. At this point, the dynamic enters a different stage entirely. The responsibility to move things forward is no longer being carried by you. It rests fully on them now. And whatever choice they make in response will reveal something important about who they are and how they handle emotional responsibility. When someone genuinely values a connection, they don't let silence become permanent without reflection or action. Another layer of awareness comes through how people respond differently to absence. That response says a lot about emotional depth and maturity. A person who is truly capable of healthy, grounded connection doesn't immediately react with defensiveness when distance appears. Instead, they tend to sit with the discomfort. They reflect rather than react. They take responsibility rather than shifting blame. They become willing to look at their own behavior honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. They ask themselves difficult questions instead of avoiding them. They recognize that growth often begins exactly where comfort ends, and that real connection requires accountability on both sides, not just emotional comfort on one. Instead of running from the distance, they may become curious about it. Instead of dismissing it, they may try to understand it. And in doing so, they may begin to see parts of themselves they had not fully confronted before. But someone who is not emotionally ready tends to respond in a very different way. They may withdraw further to protect their pride. They may minimize the connection in their own mind to avoid feeling responsible. They may create narratives that make it easier to escape accountability. Or they may simply wait, assuming things will return to how they used to be without any real change on their part. They might distract themselves instead of sitting with what the silence is revealing. They may continue expecting access to your energy without meeting it with equal effort. And through that response, or lack of response, they reveal their current emotional capacity far more clearly than words ever could. Because silence doesn't just separate people. It exposes patterns that were already there, but easier to overlook when everything was active and flowing. It reveals priorities, emotional readiness, and the level of effort someone is willing to give when nothing is being handed to them automatically anymore. And this is important to understand. Your silence was never about control, punishment, or trying to force a reaction. It was about stepping out of a dynamic where you were overextending yourself emotionally. It was about no longer carrying a connection alone that required two people to truly sustain it. And in doing so, it created space for truth to surface without interference. Now, in that space, everything becomes clearer. What is genuine begins to show itself more openly. What is unbalanced becomes harder to ignore. What is emotionally mature moves toward resolution. And what is not ready reveals itself through avoidance or inaction. That is where the real shift happens, not in dramatic moments, but in clarity. Because silence strips away distraction. And when distraction is gone, truth becomes unavoidable. What follows is no longer about guessing or hoping. It becomes about observation, about seeing what someone does when they are no longer being emotionally carried. And that alone brings a kind of clarity that words never could. Another important thing that emerges in this space is emotional truth. When you are consistently present, your energy may have been helping sustain a certain emotional familiarity within them. But once that presence is removed, what remains is what exists without external reinforcement. If their feelings are real and grounded, distance tends to intensify awareness. They begin to feel your absence in a more personal way, not as convenience lost, but as a genuine emotional gap. Moments that once felt small or routine may start carrying more weight. Memories may resurface with new meaning, and things they once overlooked may now stand out more clearly than before. The distance creates something important: perspective. And sometimes, perspective makes value clearer than closeness ever can. When you are constantly available, certain things can go unnoticed or unexamined. But when that availability is no longer there, reality becomes harder to ignore. If what they felt was shallow, if it was built more on convenience than genuine emotional depth, that truth also starts to surface in the silence. Without constant access to your energy, there are fewer distractions left in place. And what remains is what is real, unfiltered, and honest. Either outcome carries its own meaning. Because truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is still more valuable than staying inside an illusion that quietly keeps you stuck in something that was never truly aligned with you. Another shift begins within you as well. This silence is not only affecting the other person, it is also shaping something inside you. It creates space for clarity to return, space where your thoughts are no longer constantly pulled outward, and where emotional noise starts to settle. In that quieter inner state, something important begins to happen. You start reconnecting with yourself again. The energy you were previously pouring outward begins returning inward. And with that return comes restoration. Your mind becomes less scattered. Your emotions become more stable. Your inner world becomes easier to hear again, without the constant pressure of overthinking or emotional uncertainty. In that stillness, your discernment sharpens. You begin to see situations more clearly, without the emotional urgency that once clouded your judgment. And things that once felt confusing start to make more sense. Not because the situation changed instantly, but because your inner state did. There is a verse in Isaiah that speaks about strength being found in quietness and trust. And in many ways, that reflects what is happening here. Strength is not always about action or pursuit. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from stepping back, from no longer forcing what was never fully stable to begin with, and allowing truth to reveal itself on its own. This is also where something else becomes clear. Not everything is meant to continue. If a connection is not truly aligned with what is meant for you, then distance has a way of revealing that without force or conflict. When your energy is no longer sustaining it, what cannot stand on its own begins to show its fragility. And what is real becomes more steady, while what was dependent on your effort starts to fade or shift naturally. And that is not punishment. It is clarity. Sometimes what leaves is not loss. It is redirection. It is space being created for something more stable, more mutual, and more aligned with where you are meant to go next. When you stop pursuing, something else also begins to unfold on the other side. The person you stepped back from often enters a state that is not immediately obvious on the surface. Outwardly, they may seem unchanged, but internally, something shifts. At first, it usually shows up as confusion. The rhythm they were used to is gone, and the absence of it creates a sense of disorientation. Questions start forming in their mind without clear answers. They begin replaying interactions, trying to understand what changed and why it feels different now. That mental loop creates a subtle discomfort, one that keeps pulling their attention back to the silence. And the more they cannot resolve it, the more noticeable the absence becomes. But what happens next is not fixed. It depends entirely on the kind of person they are internally. Because your absence creates space, but what grows in that space depends on who is standing in it. Someone with emotional maturity tends to turn inward during that space. Instead of reacting outwardly or assigning blame immediately, they begin reflecting on themselves. They become curious about their own behavior, their own patterns, and their own role in what unfolded. When they feel the weight of the shift, their first instinct is not to immediately protect their pride or craft a version of events that keeps them blameless. Instead, if they are willing to be honest, they start to look inward. They begin questioning their own part in what unfolded. How much did they truly invest? How openly did they communicate their feelings and intentions? Did they show up with the same consistency they expected from you? Did they recognize your value while it was right in front of them, or only begin to notice it once it started slipping away? These are not comfortable questions, but emotional maturity is often revealed in the willingness to sit with them anyway. That kind of reflection carries a quiet form of accountability, one that cannot be avoided if real understanding is going to take place. And from that space of honesty, their response naturally becomes more grounded. If what existed between you truly mattered to them, then their movement toward it will not be impulsive or fear-driven. It will come from recognition, not panic. From clarity, not discomfort. After surrendering the outcome to God and stepping back fully, there is something many people quietly expect: immediate resolution. A clear sign, a fast answer, a visible shift that confirms everything at once. But life rarely unfolds in that way. God works in seasons, not sudden conclusions. Just like a seed placed in soil does not become a tree overnight, what is unfolding in your life is developing beneath the surface long before anything becomes visible above it. Roots form first. Stability is built quietly. Growth happens in ways that cannot yet be measured by what you see on the outside. So a quiet season is not an empty one. Even when nothing appears to be changing externally, something is still being shaped internally. Within them, awareness is slowly being stirred. Within you, strength is being rebuilt. Emotional weight is being lifted and redirected. Clarity is returning piece by piece, even if the full picture is not yet visible. What feels like delay is often preparation. What feels like stillness is often construction. God is not inactive in this space. He is aligning what is needed, removing what is not, and preparing both hearts in ways that cannot be rushed. You are being strengthened in areas that were quietly depleted. Patience is being formed where urgency once dominated your decisions. Stability is being rebuilt where emotional uncertainty once took hold. Nothing is wasted in this process, even when it feels slow. And while your timing may want answers now, divine timing is guided by wisdom, not urgency. It is not delayed. It is unfolding exactly as it is meant to. This is why Scripture reminds us that vision has an appointed time. It may not match human expectation, but it will arrive exactly when it is meant to. Never too early, never too late. In the middle of this, there is also a deeper internal struggle that many people face, but rarely admit openly. It is the fear that stepping back might mean losing everything. The fear that this connection might have been the only meaningful one available. The fear that letting go might lead to permanent emptiness or being left behind emotionally. These fears tend to become louder in silence. They surface when there are no immediate answers, when the future feels uncertain, and when emotional attachment starts to feel the absence of reassurance. And because those fears are emotional, they can feel very real in the moment. But fear is not clarity. Fear speaks in urgency. It pushes toward immediate action just to relieve discomfort. It tries to convince you that silence means loss, that distance means endings, that uncertainty means danger. But in reality, those are often the exact moments where clarity is being formed underneath everything else. This is where faith becomes something practical, not just conceptual. It becomes the decision to not let fear dictate your next move, to not return to old patterns just to escape discomfort, To trust that what is meant for you does not require you to abandon yourself in the process of reaching it. And in that space, you are guided back to something simple but powerful: trust. Trust that even when you cannot see progress, something is still unfolding. Trust that even when emotions are loud, they are not always accurate. Trust that even when silence stretches longer than expected, it is still part of a larger process you are not meant to rush. Because what is meant for you does not depend on panic, chasing, or emotional exhaustion. It depends on alignment. And alignment reveals itself in time, not pressure. So in this season, the real work is not forcing outcomes. It is staying grounded while things become clear on their own. In the end, what remains after all the silence, all the distance, and all the reflection is not confusion, but clarity. Clarity about what was real, what was one-sided, and what could no longer continue in the same way it once did. Because when you step back from chasing, something undeniable begins to surface. You begin to see the connection without the emotional noise that once surrounded it. You see where effort was mutual and where it was not. You see where communication was open and where it was silent. You see where presence was valued and where it was simply expected. And slowly, what was once emotionally overwhelming becomes something you can finally observe with a clearer mind and a steadier heart. But the deepest transformation does not only happen in the other person's awareness. It happens within you. This silence becomes a mirror. It reflects how much of yourself you were giving, how much emotional weight you were carrying, and how long you stayed in spaces where you were trying to keep something alive almost entirely on your own. And in that reflection, something begins to shift. Not in bitterness, not in regret, but in understanding. You start to recognize that love, connection, and emotional investment were never meant to require you to abandon yourself just to maintain them. And so, what begins as withdrawal from a situation slowly becomes a return to yourself, a return to your peace, a return to your emotional balance, a return to the part of you that was quietly asking for rest long before you ever chose to step back. At the same time, the absence you created does its own work in the background. It removes assumptions. It removes automatic access. It removes the comfort of receiving without reflection. And in that removal, truth begins to surface, not as punishment, but as exposure. Spiritually, this season also becomes a turning point. It becomes a space where you are no longer pouring everything outward, but instead allowing yourself to be restored inwardly. Where your energy is no longer scattered into uncertainty, but gathered back into stability. Where your focus slowly returns to your own life, your own growth, your own direction. And in that space, something subtle but powerful happens. You begin to trust yourself again, not just your emotions in the moment, but your deeper discernment. Your ability to sense imbalance, your awareness of what feels mutual and what feels draining, your understanding of what aligns with your peace and what quietly disrupts it. You also begin to understand that timing is not always immediate, and that silence is not absence of movement. Life continues to unfold, even when nothing appears to be happening. People are still processing, situations are still forming, and you are still being shaped by the experience in ways you may not fully see yet. You are standing in truth. And truth, even when it is quiet, even when it is gradual, even when it arrives through silence, will always guide you more accurately than anything rooted in fear ever could. So what remains at the end of this entire journey is not loss. It is alignment. It is awareness. It is return. Return to self, return to peace, and return to a version of you that no longer needs to chase what is not meeting you halfway.